The piece of paper had been in his vest pocket for 11 months, 3 weeks, and 2 days when Helen Dalton finally found out about it. She had not been looking for it. She had not been looking for anything except a needle and thread to repair the torn seam on his deputy's badge ribbon, which Marshal Bernard Merritt had left draped over the back of the chair in his office, while he stepped out to deal with a disturbance at the Red Lantern Saloon. She had simply reached into the pocket of the vest hanging there, searching for the small sewing kit she knew he sometimes kept in odd places, and her fingers had closed around a folded square of paper that was soft with age, worn thin at the creases from being opened and closed what must have been hundreds of times. She had unfolded it. Her own name stared back at her in his handwriting. Not a letter, not a note with any words attached. Just 2 words, precisely written in black ink that had faded only slightly at the edges. Helen Dalton, nothing else. Her heart stopped in a way she had never felt before, not even the night her father died, not even the morning she arrived in Caldwell, Kansas, in the summer of 1879, with nothing but a carpet bag and a heart full of secrets she was desperate to bury. Her name on a piece of paper, folded and refolded until the paper remembered the shape of being held, carried next to his heart every single day for God only knew how long. And Bernard Merritt had never said a single word to her about it. She was still standing there, her hand pressed flat against her own chest, the paper trembling between her fingers, when she heard his boots on the boardwalk outside. The distinctive sound of his spurs, the slightly uneven rhythm from the old injury to his right knee that he never talked about but that she had learned to recognize the way she recognized birdsong. The door opened, and she turned around, and when he saw what she was holding, every bit of color drained from Bernard Merritt's face. She had seen that man face down 3 armed outlaws without blinking. She had watched him talk a distraught father down from a roof in the middle of a dust storm. She had never, not once in all the months she had known him, seen him look afraid. He was afraid now. "Helen," he said, and her name in his mouth sounded completely different from how it looked written on that paper, and somehow both versions of it broke her open in exactly the same way. She had come to Caldwell, Kansas, in the summer of 1879, running from something that most people in this town did not know about, and that she had worked very hard to keep that way. The railroad had brought her, as it brought so many people westward, though in Helen Dalton's case it was less about opportunity and more about distance. She needed distance between herself and everything that had happened in St. Louis, Missouri, in the spring of that year. She needed enough miles of flat prairie between herself and the name Dalton, which meant something very specific in certain circles in St. Louis, to start breathing again. She had arrived with $32, a letter of introduction to the owner of the Caldwell Mercantile, a skill with numbers and accounts that she had developed out of necessity while keeping the books for her father's struggling import business, and a personal policy of revealing as little of herself as possible to anyone who asked. Caldwell in 1879 was a cattle town at the height of its wildness, situated right at the Kansas Indian Territory border, and it was the kind of place where people arrived with histories they preferred not to discuss, which meant that in certain respects it suited her perfectly. The mercantile owner was a rotund, cheerful man named George Putnam, who had needed a bookkeeper desperately enough that he had not asked too many questions about where she had come from or why she had come alone. He had given her the job within 20 minutes of reading the letter of introduction, shown her to the small room above the store that came with the position, and introduced her to his wife Clara, who had immediately taken Helen under her wing with the particular warmth that women on the frontier extended to other women who had clearly been through something difficult and were doing their best not to show it. Helen had settled into the rhythms of the job quickly. She was good with numbers, better than Putnam himself, and within a month she had reorganized his accounting system, identified 3 suppliers who had been quietly overcharging him for years, and renegotiated 2 of those contracts by writing letters that Putnam described as polite in their surface but firm as a courthouse door underneath. She was, by all external appearances, doing exactly what she had come to Caldwell to do, which was become someone small and unremarkable and safe. Then Bernard Merritt walked into the Mercantile on a Tuesday morning in late August, and everything she had carefully constructed began to shift. She had known who he was before he walked in. Everyone in Caldwell knew who Marshal Bernard Merritt was. He had been appointed to the position 2 years earlier by the county commission, and in that time he had turned Caldwell from one of the most lawless stops on the Cattle Drive corridor into something approaching a functioning town. He was 34 years old, originally from Ohio, tall in the way of men who had grown up with physical labor, with dark hair that was starting to show gray at the temples, and eyes the particular shade of dark brown that looks almost black in certain light. He had a reputation for being fair, which was rarer than it should have been in a frontier marshal, and for being completely, almost unnervingly impossible to read. Helen had seen him from a distance several times before that Tuesday morning. She had formed her impression of him at a distance, and had been quite satisfied to keep it that way. He came in that morning to review the records from a livestock sale that was at the center of a rustling dispute he was investigating. Putnam directed him to the back office where Helen kept the ledgers, introduced them briefly, and then disappeared to manage the front counter, leaving Helen alone with the marshal and a set of accounts she had been particularly proud of organizing. "Miss Dalton," Marshal Merritt said, with a polite tip of his hat that he then placed on the edge of the desk. "Marshal," she said. She was very conscious of her own composure. She was always conscious of her composure. It was the thing she worked hardest to maintain. "I appreciate your time. I need to trace the record of a cattle sale made on the 14th of this month. George says you would have the original documentation." She had the documentation. She found it in less than 2 minutes, which impressed him, she could tell, though his expression did not change significantly. What changed was a slight shift in the quality of his attention, a reorientation of focus that she recognized because she did it herself when she encountered something unexpected. He asked good questions. That was the first thing she noticed about him that she had not anticipated. He was not simply looking for a number to confirm something he already believed. He was genuinely trying to understand what the records showed, and his questions were precise and logical, and occasionally showed a quite sophisticated understanding of how commercial fraud worked. She found herself answering him with more detail than she had intended to provide, and at some point she had stood up from her chair to point to a specific entry in the ledger, and they had both been leaning over the same page, and she had been acutely aware of how close they were standing. He had solved his rustling case within the week. He came back to the Mercantile twice more with follow-up questions, and both times she had answered him, and both times she had been aware of that same quality of his attention, which was the quality of a person who was genuinely interested in what you were saying and not simply waiting for their turn to speak. The third time he came, the rustling case was already resolved. He came in the morning and bought a length of leather cord from the front counter, which he did not need, and then walked to the back of the store where she was working on the month-end accounts and said, rather formally, "I thought perhaps you might like to have supper at Mrs. Alderton's boarding house this evening. They do a proper meal on Thursdays." Helen had looked up from her ledger and met his eyes and said, with a composure she was very proud of, "That is very kind, Marshal. I would like that." Mrs. Alderton's Thursday supper was crowded with half a dozen other boarders, and the conversation was general and public and completely appropriate. And yet Helen had felt, sitting across the table from Bernard Merritt while he discussed the proposed new livestock regulations with the grain merchant to his left, that something had shifted between them in a way that could not be unshifted. She told herself she was being foolish. She told herself she had come to Caldwell to be small and safe and unremarkable, and that the particular way Bernard Merritt listened to her when she spoke was not a reason to abandon that plan. She told herself that she had secrets that would change how he looked at her, and that the way he looked at her now was something she would be very foolish to risk. She told herself all of this quite firmly and quite regularly throughout the autumn of 1879, during which time she and Bernard Merritt managed to find themselves at the same Thursday suppers, the same Sunday church services, the same town meetings about the new schoolhouse, the same informal gatherings on the wide front porch of the Putnam house on warm evenings. It was a small town. It was entirely natural that they would encounter each other frequently. She was lying to herself and she knew it, but she was very good at maintaining necessary fictions when the alternative felt too dangerous. Clara Putnam, who was not fooled by anyone about anything, said to Helen one October evening while they were snapping beans on the back porch, "That man looks at you like you are the only solid thing in a dust storm." "He is very courteous," Helen said. "Courteous," Clara repeated, in a tone that made perfectly clear what she thought of that assessment. "It is not simple," Helen said, which was the most honest thing she had said to anyone in Caldwell, and Clara Putnam looked at her for a long moment and then said, "I imagine it is not. Most things worth having are not simple, but complicated is not the same as impossible, Helen." Helen thought about that for a long time. What she had not told anyone in Caldwell, and what she had come 1,100 miles specifically to avoid having to tell anyone, was that her father, James Dalton, had died in February of 1879 in a St. Louis County jail cell while awaiting trial on charges of fraud and embezzlement. He had run a scheme for nearly 4 years involving falsified shipping manifests and inflated insurance claims that had defrauded a number of St. Louis businesses and investors of a substantial sum of money. Helen had known nothing of the scheme until the morning federal investigators arrived at the offices of Dalton Import and Merchant, at which point she had known for approximately 4 terrible minutes that her father was capable of something she had never suspected, and then her father had collapsed at his desk from a heart event that killed him before the investigators could formally arrest him. He had died in custody, awaiting a hearing that never happened, and the scandal had been thorough and devastating. The Dalton name in St. Louis had become synonymous with fraud and deception. Helen's mother had died when she was 12. She had no siblings. She had nothing left in St. Louis except a reputation that was not her fault and that she could not escape. She had come to Kansas to escape it. She had not escaped it as cleanly as she had hoped. Because the thing she had not been able to leave behind was the knowledge, the one that woke her at 3 in the morning and sat on her chest like a stone, that her father had kept 2 sets of books and that she was the bookkeeper, and that if anyone who knew her past decided to look carefully at what she had done in St. Louis, they might, with sufficient malice or carelessness, conclude that she had known, that she had participated, that she was as guilty as he had been. She was not guilty. She had not known. But innocence and provability were not always the same thing, and the same careful, organized mind that made her good at her job also made her very good at understanding exactly how bad things could look if someone decided to look at them in a particular way. This was why she kept her distance. This was why she maintained her composure and her carefully managed small life and her policy of revealing as little of herself as possible. And this was why Bernard Merritt, who was a marshal, who upheld the law, who had built his entire reputation and career on the integrity of the legal system, was precisely the kind of person she absolutely should not allow herself to fall in love with. She was well on her way to being in love with him by November. He knew it too. She could see it in that reoriented, focused quality of his attention whenever they were in the same room. She could hear it in the way he said her name, which he now said as Helen rather than Miss Dalton, a small shift that had happened so gradually she had not noticed it until it was already established. She could feel it in the particular careful space he maintained between them, the way he never pressed, never pushed, never assumed anything, as if he understood that she was holding something fragile and was trying to make sure she felt safe enough to hold it without breaking. He was, she thought, a deeply good man, and that made it worse. A lesser man would have been easier to resist. On the second Saturday of November 1879, there was a storm. Not a dust storm, a proper plains thunderstorm that rolled in from the southwest in the late afternoon and turned the sky the color of a bruise. Helen had been walking back from the post office when the first wall of rain hit, and she had ducked into the doorway of the marshal's office because it was the nearest shelter, and Bernard had been there, reading through warrants by lamplight. He had looked up and she was soaked through, and he had stood immediately and brought her a blanket from the back room where he sometimes slept when he had prisoners, and he had said, with that infuriating composure of his, "Sit down, Helen. I'll make coffee," as if a drenched woman arriving at his office doorway in a thunderstorm was a perfectly ordinary occurrence requiring only practical management. She had sat down. He had made coffee. The storm had shown no sign of abating, and at some point they had both been sitting across from each other at his desk with their cups, and the lamplight was warm and the rain was very loud on the roof, and she had looked at him and thought, "I cannot keep doing this." "Bernard," she said, which was the first time she had used his given name, and she saw the stillness that came over him when she said it. "Yes," he said, "I need to tell you something." He waited. He was exceptional at waiting. It was one of his most disarming qualities, and she told him all of it. Her father, the fraud, the scandal, the jail cell, the investigators with their careful eyes who had gone over every ledger she had ever touched with a focused desire to find something she was not sure she could prove was not there. She told him about leaving St. Louis with $32 and a burning need to be somewhere no one knew her name. She told him she had not done anything wrong, but that she understood if he could not simply take her word for that given who he was and what he stood for. She told him everything she had been carrying for 11 months, and when she was done, the storm was still going and her coffee had gone cold and her hands were folded in her lap with a stillness that cost her a great deal. Bernard Merritt was quiet for a long moment. Then he said, "Thank you for telling me." That was all. She looked at him. "That is your response." "I have other responses," he said carefully, "but they require knowing one more thing." "What thing?" "Whether you trust me," he said. "Not as a marshal. As a man, whether you trust me enough to believe that what you just told me is between you and me and stays that way, unless you decide otherwise." She looked at him for a long time. The rain was softer now, beginning to pass. She thought about trust and what it cost and what it protected and what happened when it was placed incorrectly. She had trusted her father and he had turned out to be a man she did not entirely know. She had trusted the life she had built in St. Louis, and it had dissolved in a morning. "Yes," she said, and she meant it absolutely. Something in him seemed to settle then, the way a pulled rope eases when the tension is released correctly. "Then I want to say," he said, "that I am glad you came to Caldwell, Helen, whatever brought you here." She did not cry. She was not a person who cried easily. But something in her chest loosened in a way that she had not realized had been clenched for 11 months. They sat together in the marshal's office while the last of the storm blew through, and they talked, really talked, about things that were not cattle sale records or town meeting proposals or the weather. He told her he had come to Kansas from Ohio because he had needed, after a war that had done something to him, he did not have precise language for, to be somewhere where the rules were simpler and the work was clear. She told him what her father had been like before the fraud, a complicated man, brilliant and affectionate and deeply flawed, and that she had loved him even at the end. He walked her home in the clearing dark, and at the door of the mercantile he held her hand for a moment and then let it go, and he said good night, and she went inside and stood in the dim hallway for a long moment before going upstairs to her room. She was absolutely in love with him. She had not intended to be, and she was not entirely certain what to do about it, but the fact itself was no longer something she could pretend otherwise about. What she did not know, and would not know until that moment 11 months later when she found the piece of paper in his vest pocket, was that Bernard Merritt had gone home that same November night and sat at his desk and taken a piece of paper and written her name on it. He had folded it precisely and put it in his vest pocket. Not as a reminder. since there was no version of any day in which he forgot her name or her face, or the quality of her mind, or the exact sound of her voice, when she forgot to be guarded and laughed at something that genuinely amused her. He had put it there as a private act of acknowledgement, a quiet ceremony for an audience of one, a way of saying to himself, without words, that this was real and she was real and he was going to do this right. He had carried it every day since. Through the cold Kansas winter, through the long spring when the cattle drives began and Caldwell swelled with drovers and the kind of trouble that came with them. Through the summer, which had brought 2 new saloons, a gunfight that had put a man in the ground and another man in jail, a diphtheria scare that had kept the whole town tense for 3 weeks, and a slow, careful, deliberate courtship between a bookkeeper and a marshal that everyone in Caldwell had been watching with varying degrees of romantic investment. He had not hidden how he felt about Helen. He had not been demonstrative in any way that embarrassed either of them, but he had been consistent and attentive and clear, in the quiet way of a man who says what he means and means what he says. He brought her books when he rode to Wichita on county business. He asked her opinions about town matters and listened to them with the same focused attention he brought to everything. When old Martin Prout tried to overcharge her for a winter coat at his dry goods store, Bernard had spoken to Prout about it in a manner that was not threatening, but that had resulted in the price being adjusted immediately. He had not asked her to marry him. He had seemed to understand, without her having to say it, that she needed time. That what she had told him in the storm that November night had not closed the book on her dark past, but had only opened the first door to trusting someone with it, and that there were still mornings when she woke with the weight of it pressing down and needed the day to prove to her again that she was safe. Clara Putnam said in the spring, "Helen, that man is waiting for you to tell him he is allowed." "Allowed to what?" Helen said. "To love you out loud," Clara said. Helen had thought about that for weeks. And then it had been an October afternoon, almost exactly a year after their first real conversation in the storm, and she had reached into his vest pocket looking for a sewing kit and found a piece of paper with her name on it. And now he was standing in the doorway of his office with all the color gone from his face, and she was holding the paper in both hands, and neither of them had said anything for what felt like a very long time. "How long?" she said. Her voice was steady. She was remarkably good at steady. He crossed the threshold. He closed the door. He stood a few feet from her and he said, "Since November, last year. You wrote my name on a piece of paper and carried it in your pocket for almost a year." "Yes." She looked at the paper in her hands, then at him. "Why?" He was quiet for a moment. Bernard Merritt, who was almost impossible to unsettle, who had faced down armed men and natural disasters, and the full chaos of a cattle town with remarkable equanimity, looked at her with an expression she had never seen on him before, which was the expression of a man who has run out of careful management and is standing in the open with nothing between himself and whatever happens next. "Because I needed to do something real with how I felt about you," he said. "And I was not certain at the time what you would welcome." Helen was quiet for a moment. She looked at the worn creases in the paper, at how soft it had become from being folded and unfolded. She thought about a man sitting alone at his desk in the dark after a November storm and writing one woman's name on a piece of paper because he needed something real. She crossed the space between them and put her hand on his chest, over his heart, and felt his breath stop for a moment. "Bernard," she said. "Yes," he said, and his voice was not quite as steady as usual. "I would like you to ask me something." He looked at her for a long moment, and then something happened in those dark eyes that she had never seen happen before, which was the falling away of every careful, considered, managed thing, and what was underneath was simple and enormous. "Helen Dalton," he said, "will you marry me?" "Yes," she said. "Absolutely yes." He kissed her then for the first time, and it was nothing like the careful, measured things he usually did, and everything like what she had thought it might be in private moments she had not quite allowed herself to fully entertain, and she kissed him back with 11 months of carefully managed feelings released all at once. And somewhere in the middle of all of it, she started laughing. A real laugh. The kind she forgot to be guarded around. And he laughed too, which she had not heard him do very often. And it turned out his laugh was extraordinary. The paper was still in her hand. She smoothed it out and looked at her name, and then she folded it back exactly along its worn creases and put it back in his vest pocket and pressed her hand flat against it. "Keep it," she said. He covered her hand with his. They were married on the 4th Saturday of November 1879, exactly 1 year to the week after the storm that had cracked them both open, in the small white church on 2nd Street by the Reverend Thomas Alderman, with George and Clara Putnam as their witnesses, and approximately 40 of Caldwell's residents packed into the pews because no one had been willing to miss it. Helen wore a dress that Clara had helped her make from cream-colored wool, because November in Kansas did not allow for any nonsense about seasonal appropriateness, and she carried a small bouquet of late-blooming prairie asters that Bernard had ridden 3 miles out of town to find. She walked down the aisle on George Putnam's arm, because George had offered with such gruff and genuine emotion that she had not had the heart to refuse, and she looked at Bernard standing at the front of the church in his good black coat, his marshal's star left back at the office for the day, and she thought, with a clarity that felt like coming home to a place she had not known was hers, that she had crossed 1,100 miles of prairie to arrive at exactly this moment. He watched her come toward him with that expression she had now seen once before, the one that was underneath all the careful management, and it was still just as enormous. Reverend Alderman performed the ceremony with suitable gravity and a certain warmth that suggested he was very pleased to be officiating this particular union. When Bernard said, "I do," he said it the way he said everything that he meant absolutely, which was quietly and without any ornamentation whatsoever, and it landed in her chest like a bell note. When she said it the same way, and she saw the corner of his mouth curve. They were introduced to the assembled congregation as Marshal and Mrs. Merritt, and the assembled congregation made a sound that suggested they had been waiting for this moment with some impatience, and then they were in the aisle and his hand was at her back, and they were walking out into the thin November sunlight together. Clara Putnam cried. George Putnam pretended he had something in his eye. The town organized a supper at the community hall that evening, which was festive and loud and included dancing, during which Bernard Merritt, who had not revealed this particular skill before, turned out to be an excellent dancer. He led her through 2 waltzes and a schottische with an assurance that she found tremendously entertaining. "Where did you learn to dance?" she said during the second waltz. "Ohio," he said. "My mother. She considered it a necessary accomplishment." "Your mother was right," Helen said. He smiled at her. She had been collecting his smiles for a year and was very glad to be in a position where she might now collect them indefinitely. They had been given the use of a small house on the edge of town as a wedding gift from 3 of the town's more prosperous citizens, who had apparently decided collectively that the Marshal needed a proper home now that he had a wife, rather than the 2 rooms he had been renting above the feed store. The house was modest and practical and had a large window facing south that caught the afternoon light beautifully, and when they arrived there together for the first time in the evening after the supper, Helen stood in the middle of the small front room and looked around and felt something settle into place in her that had been unsettled for a very long time. Bernard came to stand behind her, his hands on her shoulders, and said, "What are you thinking?" "That I did not expect this," she said. "A house." "Any of it," she said. "Any of this. I came here thinking that the best I could manage was invisible. That the best possible outcome was that no one would look at me long enough to find anything concerning." "I looked at you," he said. "Yes," she said, "you did." She turned around and looked up at him. "And you found something concerning, my name, my past, my father." "I found you," he said simply. She reached up and put her hand against his face, and he turned his head slightly and pressed his mouth to her palm, and this quiet, private gesture undid her more completely than anything that had come before. The house became a home in the way that things become themselves when the right people inhabit them. Helen brought her books and her ledgers, and the small things she had accumulated in her room at the Mercantile, which was not very much but which arranged themselves around the house in ways that surprised her with how immediate and correct they felt. Bernard brought his few personal belongings from the rooms above the feed store, including a small framed drawing of the Ohio countryside that he had carried from place to place for years, and which he hung above the fireplace without explaining it, though she understood without asking that it was something to do with before the war, and before the West, and before becoming the man she had married. She kept her job at the Mercantile. This was not a question between them. She had not offered to quit, and he had not suggested it. He understood, as she did, that her work was a part of who she was and not simply a means of survival, and that the mind she brought to the ledgers and the accounts was the same mind she brought to everything else and was not something to be set aside because she had a husband. Clara Putnam had been thrilled when Helen told her she intended to continue working. "Sensible," Clara said. "You keep those books, Helen. George would be back to paying double for his flour within a month without you." George Putnam did not disagree. The first winter of their marriage was a cold one. Kansas winters are not forgiving, and 1879 running into 1880 was particularly severe. The cattle drives had ended with the season, and Caldwell's population had contracted to its winter proportion, which was smaller and quieter and more insular. The town turned inward in the way of frontier communities in hard weather, people relying on their neighbors more heavily, the social fabric pulled closer by the cold. Helen and Bernard spent the long winter evenings together in the house with the south-facing window, which was beautiful in the afternoons when the pale winter light came through. She read or worked on accounts. He worked through the administrative responsibilities of the marshal's office that the busy season left him little time for. They talked in the evenings with the ease of two people who had discovered that they were genuinely interested in each other's minds, which was something Helen had not entirely expected, had hoped for abstractly without allowing herself to expect it concretely, and which turned out to be one of the greatest pleasures of her married life. He told her on a January evening when the wind was from the north and the windows were iced about the war. Not everything. She did not think he had language for everything, and she did not press him, but he told her enough. The regiment, the battles, the men he had known who were not there anymore, the particular silence that had settled inside him in the years after, which had been the reason for Kansas, and the reason for the marshal's badge, and the reason for the code of rules and law that he had built his life around. Because after that much chaos, having a clear framework of right and wrong had felt like sanity. She told him in February about a particular morning in her father's offices when she had found a discrepancy in the accounts that she had not understood and had mentioned to her father, and he had explained it away with something plausible, and she had accepted the explanation. She had been thinking about that morning since February of the previous year, whether she could have known if she had pressed harder, whether pressing harder would have changed anything, whether the guilt she carried was earned or inherited. Bernard listened to all of it without interrupting, and then he said, "You trusted your father. That is not a failure of character. That is what decent people do with the people they love." "And when the people they love are not what they believed," Helen said. "Then they grieve," he said. "The person and the idea of the person, both of those are real losses. You are allowed to grieve both." She had not, she realized, fully allowed herself to do that yet. She had been too busy surviving to grieve. She thought about it afterward, about the strange gift of being known well enough that someone could see the thing you had not managed to see yourself. By spring, she was settled into the life of the town in a different way than she had been as the Mercantile's bookkeeper. She was the marshal's wife now, which brought its own particular social position in a frontier community, and she inhabited it with the same practical competence she brought to everything. She became a reliable presence at the women's sewing circle, not because she was particularly enthusiastic about the domestic aspects of it, but because the circle was where information moved in Caldwell, and she had decided that being informed was always preferable to the alternative. She became the unofficial recorder at the Town Improvement Committee meetings, because the official recorder was a wool merchant named Hobson who wrote illegibly and forgot half of what was said. She also, quietly and without announcing it, began to use her accounting skills to help families in the community who were struggling with debt or financial confusion. The frontier was full of people who had come west with dreams and found themselves at the mercy of creditors or suppliers who understood numbers better than they did. Helen understood numbers better than almost anyone, and she had strong feelings about the powerful preying on the uninformed. She helped the Miller family renegotiate a loan that had been structured in a way that was technically legal and practically predatory. She helped young Tom Briggs understand that the contract he had signed with the cattle agent was not as binding in the specific situation as the cattle agent had suggested. She helped 3 different families identify errors in their accounts at the dry goods store that were consistently in the store's favor, which she reported to Bernard with a level of pointed understatement that he found both impressive and very slightly alarming. "Are you suggesting Martin Prout is defrauding his customers?" Bernard said. "I am suggesting," Helen said, in the precise tone she used when she was being careful to say exactly what she meant and no more, "that his accounting is remarkably and consistently erroneous in one direction. What that suggests to you as Marshal is entirely your business." Bernard had investigated and found that the errors were deliberate, and Prout had paid restitution and revised his practices under the clear understanding that the next incident would result in charges. The affected families received their money back. The story got around, as stories did in small towns, and Helen's reputation in Caldwell shifted from the marshal's wife who keeps Putnam's books to something more complex and more substantial. She was content. This was not a small thing. She had not been content in a long time. The trouble came in the June of 1880, which was the summer that Helen and Bernard had been married for 7 months, and which should have been, and largely was, a busy and prosperous season for Caldwell. The cattle drives had resumed, the town was full of activity and commerce, and Helen's books at the Mercantile showed the healthiest quarterly figures she had managed since taking the job. The trouble arrived on a Tuesday, as trouble so often did. His name was Curtis Webb, and he was an investigator for the Federal Postal Inspector's office in St. Louis, and he had a badge and a letter of authority, and a set of questions about James Dalton's fraudulent shipping operations that he had been compiling for more than a year, and that had led him, eventually, to a town called Caldwell, Kansas, and a woman named Helen Dalton, who was now apparently Helen Merritt. He came to the Mercantile first. George Putnam, alarmed, sent for Bernard before sending for Helen, which was the right instinct, though by the time Bernard arrived at the Mercantile, Webb was already in the back office with Helen, who had heard his introduction with her hands folded on the desk and her expression revealing precisely nothing. Bernard walked into the back office and found his wife sitting across a desk from a federal investigator with a composure so perfect it was almost frightening, and he came to stand beside her and placed his hand on the back of her chair and looked at Curtis Webb and said, evenly, "What is this about?" Webb was a thin man in his 40s with the careful, slightly colorless manner of a man who spent his professional life dealing with documents and people who did not want to talk to him. He looked at Bernard's badge and then at Bernard's face and then at Helen and then back at Bernard, and seemed to be doing rapid calculations about the situation. "I am here on a matter of inquiry related to the operations of Dalton Import and Merchant of St. Louis, Missouri," Webb said, "specifically the fraudulent activities of the late James Dalton." "My father is dead," Helen said. Her voice was level. "He died in February of last year." "Yes, ma'am, I am aware of that. My inquiry pertains to the question of whether other individuals had knowledge of or participated in the scheme." "I did not," Helen said. "With respect, ma'am, that is exactly what someone who had would say," Bernard said very quietly. "Watch your tone." Webb looked at him. "Marshal, I have a federal letter of inquiry. I am not exceeding my authority." "Your authority and your courtesy are separate matters," Bernard said. "Continue." Webb continued. He had questions about specific transactions, specific dates, specific documentation. Helen answered every one of them. She answered with a precision and a detail that Webb clearly had not expected, because she remembered every account she had ever kept, every ledger entry, every discrepancy she had noticed and reported and had explained away. And she had spent more than a year turning this material over in her mind, and was prepared to discuss it with an exactness that gradually, noticeably shifted the quality of Webb's attention from interrogation to something more like genuine inquiry. It took nearly 2 hours. When Webb had exhausted his questions, he sat back in his chair and looked at her with an expression that had some reluctant respect in it and said, "You were aware of none of it." "I was aware of one discrepancy," Helen said, "which I raised with my father and which he gave me an explanation for that I accepted. Had I known that explanation was false, I would have taken the documentation to the appropriate authorities. That is not a claim I can prove to you except by the evidence of my own records, which are thorough and available and show no pattern of concealment on my part." "Your records are thorough," Webb agreed. He was quiet for a moment. "They are, in fact, the most helpful documentation I have found in this entire inquiry. Your organization of those accounts made it possible to identify exactly what your father was doing and exactly where the fraud occurred." Helen looked at him steadily. "You mean my honest bookkeeping is the primary evidence against his dishonest one?" "Yes, ma'am," Webb said. "That is precisely what I mean." There was a pause. Helen said, "Then I would appreciate a written statement from your office to that effect." Webb looked slightly startled. Then he nodded slowly. "That is reasonable." Bernard had not said anything for quite some time. He said now to Webb, "Is there anything further requiring my wife's attention today?" "No, Marshal, not today. I may have additional questions by correspondence." "Those can come through me," Bernard said. "If you require her to answer them in person, you will let me know in advance and I will make arrangements." Webb looked at him again, and this time there was something in the look that was less calculation and more straightforward recognition of the fact that this conversation was over. He gathered his papers and stood and gave a formal nod to both of them and left. The silence after he left was different from most silences. Helen sat very still for a moment. Then she put both her hands flat on the desk and looked at them, and Bernard came around the desk and crouched down beside her chair so his face was level with hers. "All right," he said. "I am all right," she said. "I know you are," he said. "That is not what I meant." She looked at him. Her composure had not cracked during the interrogation, but there was something in her eyes now that was not composed. That was the thing underneath the composure, which was exhaustion and relief, and the particular raw feeling of having been accused and having survived the accusation without flinching. "He said my bookkeeping proved I was innocent," she said. "Yes. Because I was too good at my job to have been hiding anything, because if I had been hiding something the records would not have been what they were." "Yes," Bernard said. "Exactly." She was quiet. Then she said, "My father was not a good man, Bernard. He was many things and some of them were wonderful and I loved him and I always will in some complicated way, but he was not a good man." "I know," he said. "And I am not him," she said. "I know that too," he said. "I have always known that." She pressed her lips together for a moment and looked at the ceiling and then back at him, and she said, "I would like to go home." "Yes," he said. "Let's go home." Webb's written statement arrived by post 3 weeks later, on official federal stationery, attesting that Helen Dalton Merritt had been found to be without involvement in or knowledge of the fraudulent activities of her late father, and that her documentation had in fact been materially useful to the federal inquiry. Bernard read it at the breakfast table, and handed it across to her without comment. She read it twice, folded it carefully, and placed it in the small wooden box where she kept her important documents. She did not say anything for a moment. Then she said, "It is over." "Yes," he said. She looked at him. "All of it, the whole thing." "The dark past I carried across 1,100 miles of prairie. It is just over." "You carried it well," he said. "I was terrified the entire time," she said. "I know," he said. "You were also brave." She got up from the table and came around and sat down next to him instead of across from him, and leaned against his shoulder, and he put his arm around her. And they sat like that in the morning light coming through the south window for a long time without saying anything, which was one of the very good things about being married to someone who understood the value of silence. Life in Caldwell moved in seasons, and the seasons moved in rhythms that Helen found herself settling into with a pleasure she had not anticipated. The end of the cattle drive season in autumn brought a particular peace to the town, a drawing inward, a return to the smaller and quieter version of itself that was less dramatic but in many ways more itself. The winters were hard but beautiful in their austerity. The springs were wild and hopeful. The summers were enormous. By the following spring of 1881, she was expecting their first child. She told Bernard on a warm April morning while they were walking along the edge of the creek south of town, which was running high and fast with snowmelt, and the prairie was starting to show the first green of the season. She had been calculating for 2 weeks and was quite confident in her arithmetic, which she mentioned to him, because he knew her well enough that leading up to the announcement through anything other than straightforward information would have confused him. "I believe we can expect an addition to the household in approximately October," she said. He stopped walking. He turned to look at her. He said, "Helen." "Yes," she said simply. What happened in Bernard Merritt's face then was something she would carry with her for the rest of her life. He was a man who managed his expression with considerable skill as a general rule, and in that moment he simply did not. What was there instead was joy, clear and unmanaged and enormous, and he took her face in both his hands and kissed her forehead and then just held her face, looking at her as if she was something extraordinary. "Are you well?" he said. "I am perfectly well," she said. "I am not fragile, Bernard. I know you are not fragile," he said, "but I am asking." "I am very well," she said. "I am happy," he smiled. He had one of those smiles that she had been collecting since the beginning, and this one was new, a version she had not seen before, fuller than most. "I am very happy too," he said. Clara Putnam, when told, immediately assumed organizational authority over the next several months in a way that was slightly overwhelming and entirely welcome. She had raised 4 children of her own and had strong opinions about what was needed and when, and she expressed them freely and with great warmth, and Helen accepted the help with more gratitude than she would have predicted, having been generally self-sufficient for most of her adult life. There was something different now. There was a network of people around her who cared about her welfare and who were invested in the outcome, and she was in the unusual and rather wonderful position of not having to manage everything entirely alone. Bernard was attentive without being overbearing, which required considerable judgment on his part, and which he managed very well. He continued to carry his paper in his vest pocket. She knew it was there. They never spoke of it directly after that first day, but sometimes she would reach over and press her hand flat against his chest, over the pocket, and he would cover her hand with his, and that was its own language. The child arrived on a crisp October morning in 1881, delivered by Dr. Margaret Howe, who was Caldwell's physician and one of the few women practicing medicine on the frontier, a fact that Helen found deeply satisfying. The labor was long but uncomplicated, and Clara was there through all of it, and Bernard paced the parlor in a manner that Clara described later as impressively restrained for a first-time father. The child was a boy. They named him James Bernard Merritt, which had been Helen's idea and which had required her to sit with it for a while before being certain, the James being for her father, the complicated man she had loved in all his flaws, because she believed that names were not endorsements of everything a person had been but acknowledgments of the fact of them. Bernard had not questioned her reasoning. He had understood it immediately, which was one of the ongoing gifts of being married to him. James was a sturdy, serious baby who regarded the world with an expression of profound assessment that made Bernard laugh when he saw it the first time and say, "He has your eyes, and your expression." "What expression?" Helen said. "The one that means you are deciding whether the information you are being given is accurate," Bernard said. Helen looked at the baby, who was indeed looking at her with an extremely evaluative gaze, and she said, "That seems like a useful trait." James grew into a sturdy, serious toddler, and then a sturdy, serious small boy, with a great curiosity about mechanical things and an unexpected passion for listening to stories, which he would sit for with a focus that he clearly inherited from his father. Helen continued to keep the mercantile's books and to help families in the community with their financial difficulties. Bernard continued to marshal Caldwell through the changes that the early 1880s brought, which included the increasing reach of the railroad, the decline of the open cattle drive era, and the slow transformation of the frontier into something more settled and less lawless. Caldwell changed. It changed in the way that frontier towns either changed or died. The wildness receded, the institutions grew more permanent, the population became more stable. Bernard's job changed with it, the dramatic confrontations becoming rarer, the administrative and legal work becoming more central. He was good at both versions of the job. Helen thought privately that the quieter version suited him better, that the man who had come to the frontier looking for clear rules and structured purpose was perhaps more genuinely himself, in a town that was becoming something sustainable, rather than something constantly on the edge of chaos. A daughter came in the autumn of 1883, a red-haired creature of exceptional volume and very strong opinions, whom they named Clara after Clara Putnam, who cried for a full 10 minutes when she heard, and then immediately began planning the christening. Clara Putnam, named little Clara Merritt, was nothing like her older brother in temperament and exactly like him in determination, and the combination of the two children in the Merritt household was, Helen thought, rather like keeping accounts with numbers that were constantly rearranging themselves, which she found challenging and entirely wonderful. The children grew. The town grew. The marriage grew in the way of things that are properly rooted, not always dramatically but always genuinely, adding depth and texture over time. There were difficult seasons, as there were in any life. Bernard was badly hurt in the winter of 1884 when a horse came down on his right leg during a storm, re-injuring the old wound from his war years, and he spent 6 weeks recovering and was in considerable pain for several months after. Helen nursed him with a practical efficiency that he alternately appreciated and argued with, because he was not a patient, and she was not particularly sympathetic to impatience when the medical facts were clear. "You need to rest the leg," she told him, on the third day when he attempted to return to his office before he could walk without a cane. "I can manage the office on a cane," he said. "You can," she said, "and you will re-damage the tissue and extend your recovery by several weeks. You cannot manage the office effectively on a cane while also being in significant pain, and there is a perfectly competent deputy who is handling matters well." He looked at her. "You are going to win this argument, are you not?" "I always win arguments in which I am correct," she said pleasantly. He sat back down. He rested the leg. He healed properly, though he walked with a more pronounced limp afterward that he accepted with his usual lack of complaint. She was ill in the spring of 1885, a respiratory illness that started as a common cold and settled into her lungs in a way that alarmed Dr. Howe enough that she put Helen to bed for 2 weeks and restricted her visitors. Bernard managed the household and the children during this time with a focused efficiency that both impressed and touched Helen when she was well enough to notice it. He also sat beside her bed every evening after the children were asleep and read to her, because she was bored and frustrated, and he knew that the only thing that reliably soothed her frustration was engaging her mind, and reading to her was something he could do. He had a good reading voice, measured and clear, and she fell asleep to it on several evenings and woke to find him still sitting there, asleep in the chair with the book in his lap. She recovered, fully and completely, which both of them acknowledged with a relief neither of them fully articulated but which was present in everything for a while afterward. By 1886, Caldwell was a genuinely different town from the one Helen had arrived in 7 years earlier. The cattle drive era was effectively over. The wild saloons had either closed or become respectable establishments. The marshal's office had expanded to include a proper court recorder and 2 permanent deputies. The schoolhouse had been rebuilt in brick. The railroad connection had brought regular mail service, a telegraph office, and the beginning of a small but real commercial district that included a bank, 2 proper hotels, and a photographer's studio. Helen had, over these years, expanded her own work considerably. What had started as keeping George Putnam's books had grown, organically and without her entirely planning it, into something more like a financial consultancy. She helped businesses structure their accounts. She helped families navigate debt and land contracts. She worked, quietly, with the county legal office on cases where financial documentation was relevant, which was often. The federal statement from Webb's inquiry remained in her document box, but it had long since become unnecessary, because she had built a reputation in this community on the basis of her own work and character that had nothing to do with her father or St. Louis, or what she had been running from when she arrived. She realized one morning while reviewing a complicated ranch ledger that 3 different lawyers had failed to make sense of exactly who she had always hoped to become. Not precisely the version she had imagined from the vantage point of her father's offices in St. Louis, but the real version. The one that had been shaped by everything that had happened, the loss and the fear and the miles of prairie and a storm in November, and a piece of paper in a vest pocket. In the summer of 1887, George Putnam, who was 62 and had been mentioning his intention to retire for 3 years, finally made it concrete. He sat Helen down in the back office of the Mercantile and told her he wanted to sell the business and wanted to offer her the first opportunity to purchase it. She went home that evening and told Bernard, who listened without interrupting and then said, "Can we afford it? With the money I have saved from my work, plus a bank loan on reasonable terms, and given that my income from the business would more than cover the loan payments within 18 months based on current revenue, yes," Helen said, "we can afford it." He looked at her for a moment. "You have already calculated it." "I have been calculating it for 2 years," she said. "Since he first mentioned retirement, I wanted to have a clear picture before I said anything." Bernard was quiet for a moment, and then he smiled, that particular smile she had been collecting since the beginning, and he said, "Then I think you should own a mercantile, Helen." She negotiated the purchase herself, which pleased her considerably. Putnam gave her a better price than the business was worth on the market, which she tried to refuse, and which he refused to allow her to refuse, insisting with great gruff sincerity that she had made him more money over the years than the difference, and that her continued care of the business was worth the discount. She signed the papers in September 1887 and became the owner of Putnam's Mercantile, which she renamed, after brief reflection, Merritt General Store, and which she ran with the same organized precision she had brought to the books, plus an additional layer of strategic thinking about inventory and suppliers, and the changing needs of a town that was no longer a frontier outpost but an actual settled community. The business did well. This was not a surprise to anyone who knew Helen. James was 6 by then, with his father's steadiness and his mother's precision, and already exhibiting an interest in how things worked that he expressed by taking apart any mechanical object left within his reach. Clara was 4 and had opinions about everything, and expressed them continuously, and was the kind of child around whom it was impossible to be solemn for very long, which Helen suspected was going to be one of her most useful qualities throughout her life. Bernard's tenure as marshal had reached a point where the county commission had begun, diplomatically, to discuss what the next stage of Caldwell's law enforcement structure might look like as the town matured and the wild frontier character receded further. These were not unpleasant conversations. They were conversations about success, about the fact that the work of building a lawful, functioning community had been done well enough that the nature of the work was changing. He came home one October evening in 1888, 9 years after the storm and the coffee and the piece of paper, and sat down at the kitchen table where Helen was working through the store's autumn accounts and said, "The commission has offered me the county judge's appointment." She looked up. She waited. "The circuit judge position has been vacant since Harmon retired in the spring," he said. "They have been looking for someone to take it. They asked me today." "What did you tell them?" she said. "That I would need to think about it and speak with my wife," he said. She considered him for a moment. She thought about Bernard Merritt and the law, the relationship he had with it, what it had been and what it was. The marshal's badge had been about order, about the raw work of keeping chaos from consuming a place that was still finding its shape. A judgeship was something different. It was about the settled, considered application of the law, about the reasoning and the deliberation, about being the person who decided what was right when everything had calmed down enough to actually think clearly about it. "It suits you better," she said. He looked at her. "You think so?" "The marshal's work was necessary and you were very good at it," she said. "But the judgment, the careful, considered thinking about what the law actually means and what is actually fair, that is what you have always done best, Bernard. That is the part of this job that has always been most genuinely you." He was quiet for a long moment. Then he said, "I have been carrying a badge since 1877. "I know," she said. "It has been the shape of everything." "I know," she said. "But you are not the badge. You are the person who wore it. That person would wear the robe just as well and more comfortably, I think." He looked at her for a long time with that expression that was the one underneath everything, open and enormous. Then he said, "What would I do without your accounting of things?" "You would manage," she said dryly. "Rather less efficiently, but you would manage." He accepted the appointment. The swearing-in was in January of 1889, in the new county courthouse that had been built the previous year, a proper brick building that represented as much as anything what Caldwell had become. Helen sat in the front row with James and little Clara, and she watched Bernard Merritt place his hand on a Bible and take an oath to uphold the law and render justice with fairness. And she thought about a November storm and a piece of paper, and about all the distance between that moment and this one, and about how distance was not always loss. That evening at home, he stood in the kitchen in his good coat and looked somewhat at a loss without the familiar weight of the marshal's badge on his chest. She watched him for a moment, and then she crossed the kitchen and reached into his vest pocket and found the paper, which was there. It was always there. It was soft as cloth now, thin as a whisper, the words faded but still legible. She unfolded it one more time. Her name. 2 words in faded ink, worn by years of being carried. She folded it and put it back. "Still there," she said. "Always," he said. She looked up at him, and he was looking at her with that expression, and she thought, not for the first time, that she could spend her whole life and not come to the end of being glad she had reached into that pocket. "I love you," she said. She said it simply and directly because that was how she said important things. "I love you," he said, the same way. No ornamentation. Absolutely meant. In the spring of 1889, they discovered that Clara Merritt the younger was going to have a sibling. This announcement was greeted by James with a philosophical acceptance, and by Clara with an expression of extreme suspicion, followed by a great many questions, and by Bernard and Helen with the particular warmth of people for whom this kind of news no longer brought the anxious wondering of the first time, but the deeper, quieter joy of knowing what it means. This child, a boy again, was born in November, which meant their children now included an October birthday and 2 November birthdays, which Helen found statistically interesting, and which caused Clara to declare that the new baby should have been born in a different month, on the grounds that sharing one's birthday month with a sibling was a significant inconvenience. The baby, whom they named Robert Thomas Merritt, after Bernard's older brother who had not come back from the war, seemed indifferent to this criticism. He was a notably peaceful baby, which was a relief, and Clara adjusted to his existence within approximately 2 weeks and afterward became fiercely proprietary about him. The Merritt household with 3 children was noisier and more chaotic than it had been with 2, and Helen found that she loved it. She had not expected to love chaos quite as much as she did. She had thought of herself, most of her life, as someone who preferred order and structure, and she still did, but she had discovered that the chaos of a household of people who loved each other was a completely different variety from the chaos of disorder and uncertainty, and that she had a considerable tolerance for the former. She managed the store and the children and the household accounts, and Bernard's case records when he needed help organizing documentation, and the town improvement committee she had somehow ended up chairing. And she did all of these things simultaneously with the focused efficiency that was her natural mode. Bernard presided over his court and ruled with the measured fairness that everyone who had watched him work had always known he was capable of, and he came home in the evenings and ate dinner with his family and read to his children, and sat with his wife in the lamplight while the plains dark settled around the house with the south window. And it was, by any accounting, a life. James turned 10 in October of 1891, and had become, by that point, a child who could fix almost any piece of mechanical equipment in the store, and who was reading at a level that caused his teacher, Mrs. Bancroft, to write a note home saying she was struggling to keep him adequately challenged, which delighted Helen and amused Bernard. Clara was 8 and had found her vocation, which appeared to be the management of other people's affairs, a quality that Helen recognized with rueful affection as something she could not trace to either side of the family without finding her own reflection in it. Robert was 2 and had discovered running, which he practiced with tremendous dedication and very little sense of direction. The decade turned. The frontier turned with it into something else. The Wild West that Helen had arrived in with $32 and a desperate need for distance was receding into history even as they were still living in it. The open range was closing. The law was settling. The town of Caldwell had a school, a courthouse, a hospital, 3 churches, and a newspaper that published twice a week. The Indians of the territory to the south were being pressed further and further into constrained existence in ways that Helen followed in the newspaper reports with a troubled attention, and that Bernard addressed in his court, when cases from the territory came before him, with a careful fairness that tried to navigate impossible situations without pretending they were simple. These injustices were real, and they both knew it, and neither of them had the power to undo what was being done by federal policy to people who had lived on this land longer than any of them. And Bernard made clear in his rulings that the law he served was meant to protect all persons, and not only those who arrived on the railroad from the east. And Helen made sure that her store extended credit to families from the territory who crossed the border to trade with the same terms as every other customer. And they both understood that these were small things against large wrongs, and they did them anyway, because small things done honestly were still worth doing. In the autumn of 1893, when James was 12 and Clara was 10 and Robert was 4, Helen sat down on a Sunday afternoon and opened the wooden box where she kept her important documents. The federal statement from Webb was there, yellowed but intact, the deed to the store, the children's birth records, the marriage certificate from the Reverend Alderman, who had retired to Missouri 3 years earlier. She found what she was looking for at the bottom of the box, a letter she had written and never sent, addressed to a woman named Grace Morton, who had been her closest friend in St. Louis and from whom she had parted without a proper goodbye on the morning she left for the railroad station with her $32 and her carpet bag and her secrets. She had started the letter a dozen times over 14 years and never finished it. This time she finished it. She told Grace about Caldwell, about the store, about Bernard and the children, and the long, strange, good path from that St. Louis morning to this Kansas afternoon. She told Grace that she was well and that she was happy, and that she was sorry she had left without a word, because Grace had deserved better than that and she had been too frightened at the time to give her better. She sent the letter. Grace Morton, now Grace Patterson, replied 6 weeks later with 3 pages of news, and a warmth that 14 years had not significantly diminished. And they began a correspondence that went on for years. And the following summer Grace and her husband traveled through Kansas on their way to Denver and stopped in Caldwell for 3 days and met Bernard and the children. And Helen had the experience, which she had not anticipated as being particularly moving, of watching someone from her before see her after, and seeing in that person's face the reflection of how much had changed and how fully it had resolved. Bernard and Helen celebrated their 15th anniversary in November of 1894. They did not do anything elaborate. They had supper together after the children were in bed, and Helen made the honey cake she had learned from Clara Putnam, and they sat at the kitchen table in the lamplight and talked and were quiet in equal measure, in the comfortable rhythm of people who have spent 15 years learning each other and still find the learning interesting. She reached across the table and held out her hand, palm up, and he looked at it for a moment and then placed his hand in hers. 15 years, she said. Yes, he said. I found a piece of paper in your pocket 15 years ago October, she said. You found it 13 months after I put it there, he said. I had been carrying it for 13 months. And you carry it still? Yes, she looked at him. The lamplight was warm on his face. He was 49 years old, his hair fully gray now but his face still essentially itself, the face she had been learning for 15 years and still could sit and look at with undiminished interest. She thought about the man who had written her name on a piece of paper and put it in his pocket because he needed to do something real with how he felt. I am glad you are a man who does things like that, she said. What kind of things, he said. Quiet things, she said. Real things, things you do not announce. He turned her hand over in his and looked at it. I am glad you found it. I was terrified when I found it, she said. I know, he said. Your face. Was I that transparent? Only to me, he said. And only because I had been watching your face for a year and knew the difference between all the versions of it. She laughed. That real laugh, the one she had forgotten to guard when she was around him. The years that followed were, in the deepest sense of the word, good ones. Not without difficulty, because no life is without difficulty, but good in the way of things that have been built on honest ground. James grew into a young man with his father's steadiness and his mother's precision, and at 17 he announced that he intended to study engineering, which made Helen quietly proud and made Bernard take him to Wichita to look at the rail yard, which was exactly the right thing to do. Clara at 15 was formidable and funny, and had her mother's way with accounts and her own entirely original way with people, which was warmer than her mother's and more flexible, and which Helen thought would serve her extremely well. Robert at 9 was still peaceful, still inclined to run in unplanned directions, and had lately developed a passion for drawing that filled every scrap of paper in the household. Helen and Bernard had one more child, a girl, born in the spring of 1898, when Helen was 44 and Bernard was 53, and they had both assumed that chapter of their life was finished. She arrived in April, unplanned and very welcome, small and dark-haired and possessed of a focused, examining gaze that she clearly inherited from both parents simultaneously. They named her Helen Ruth Merritt, Ruth being Bernard's mother's name, and the household's response to her arrival was unanimous delight. Robert, at 9, was particularly attached to her and appointed himself her chief protector, a role he took seriously. The 20th century arrived. Bernard retired from the judgeship in 1901 and turned the bench over to a younger man he had been mentoring for 3 years, and he and Helen entered the particular freedom of the older years that is not an absence of purpose but a different kind of it. He read more. He walked more. He began writing down, at Helen's quiet encouragement, his observations about the law and the frontier years, not a formal history but a personal account, clear and measured and true. She continued to run the store, though James's younger cousin had come on to help manage the day-to-day, and she continued the financial consultation work that had grown over 20-some years into something that had helped a significant number of families in the county navigate complicated situations. The name Dalton meant nothing particular in Caldwell. It had never meant anything particular in Caldwell. The name Merritt meant a great deal. She had built that meaning herself, with her own work and her own character, and she was glad of it in a straightforward way that had nothing complicated in it anymore. On a warm September morning in 1903, Helen was in the back room of the store reviewing the quarterly accounts when she heard the bell over the front door, and then heard her name spoken in Bernard's voice, and she came out to the front of the store to find him standing there in his good coat with a small bunch of late summer wildflowers that he had clearly gathered from somewhere on his morning walk. "It is not any occasion," she said. "No," he said. "Then what are these for?" He held them out to her. "Because I wanted to." She took them. She looked at them and then at him, and she thought about a November storm and a piece of paper and 2 words written in ink that had faded to the color of shadows, and about everything that had grown from that single small, private act of acknowledgement. "Come home for lunch," she said. "I will close the store for an hour." "All right," he said. She put the flowers in a jar of water, and they walked home together through the September morning, through the town that had been frontier and was now simply a town, solid and ordinary and real, under the wide Kansas sky that had not changed at all. That afternoon, in the house with the south-facing window that caught the afternoon light beautifully, she reached into his vest pocket as she had been doing for 23 years and felt the paper, which was there. It was soft as velvet now, worn so thin she could almost see through it, kept together by something more than paper, by the intention of the man who had written on it and carried it and never put it down. She did not take it out this time. She simply pressed her hand flat against it through the cloth and felt his hand come over hers, warm and certain, the way it always did. Her name on a piece of paper, carried against his heart. Nobody else had ever known. Nobody had needed to. It had always been enough, entirely and completely, that he did. They sat together in the afternoon light and listened to the sounds of the town outside, and the meadowlarks beginning to gather for autumn, and the distant laughter of young Ruth chasing something across the yard, and the steady sound of each other's breathing, which was a sound they had each been listening to for a very long time and fully intended to go on listening to for a great deal longer. The prairie stretched out in every direction from their window. The sky was the particular blue that it only gets in Kansas in September, clean and enormous and full of light. The piece of paper was in his pocket and her name was on it, and this was still, as it had always been, enough. More than enough. It was everything.